Chapter 26. Chuang-Tzu, His Irony and Humor. Says Chuang-Tzu. Confucius went to the West to deposit his writings in the library of the imperial house of Chow, and Tzu-Lu counseled him, saying, I have heard that the officer in charge was one named Lao-Tsu, who has resigned his office and lives privately. As you, master, wish to deposit your works, why not go and gain his help? Confucius said, Good, and went to see Lao-Tsu, who refused his assistance, whereupon the other began to give a summary of spring and autumn with the view of convincing Lao-Tsu. But Lao-Tsu interrupted. This is all nonsense. What are your fundamentals? Charity, replied Confucius, and duty to one's neighbor. Said Lao-Tsu, and do you think charity and righteousness constitute man's original nature? I do. Without charity the princely man could not be what he is. Without righteousness he would be of no effect. These two belong to the original nature of the superior man. Lao-Tsu continued. Tell me what you mean by charity and righteousness. Confucius answered. To be in one's inmost heart in sympathy with all things, to love all men without selfishness, this is the characteristic of charity and duty to one's neighbor. Lao-Tsu exclaimed. What stuff! Does not universal love contradict itself? Is not your elimination of self a positive manifestation of self? Meaning that if everyone loves everyone there is nothing to set forth love as love, no background against which it can be perceived. In the same way absolute unselfishness awakens absolute selfishness as a necessary result of its practice. It must be owned that Confucius is in a difficulty here. He does not answer, and Lao-Tsu goes on triumphant. Sir, if you would cause the empire to be rightly nourished, think of heaven and earth, which go their way undeflected. Think of birds and of beasts, who collect in their dens, and of trees and shrubs, which grow upright without deviation. Be like these. Follow the law and you will reach your end. Why must you make such a pother about charity and duty to one's neighbor as though beating a drum for the hue and cry after a fugitive? Alas, master, you have brought much confusion into the mind of men. Some dispute that this conversation is from the hand of Chuang-Tzu, possibly because they are surprised to find him allowing Confucius his own opinions, if even for the purpose of putting them to flight. And yet it may very well be a part of the actual discourse which took place at the meeting in Lo. The story of Confucius and Robert Chi that I give now is certainly spurious in that it was not written by Chuang-Tzu. But it is so well written, so entirely in the manner of his philosophic stories, and it so perfectly illustrates a favorite point of his that it was long supposed to be his. And I think this a highly appropriate place for such an ancient and valuable effort in the art of transcendental philosophy. I give it condensed as follows. Robert Chi had 9,000 followers. He ravaged the empire, plundering nobles and people. He lifted cattle. He stole women. Family ties were nothing to his greed. He had no respect for parents or brothers and neglected ancestor worship. Where he passed the greater states flew to arms, the smaller to refuge. Said Confucius to the elder brother of Robert Chi. An elder brother should admonish his junior. If it is not so, there is an end to the value of these relationships. Now you, sir, are one of the scholars of the age, and your brother is Robert Chi. I blush for you. Let me go and exhort him on your behalf. As to what you say, sir, replied the brother, if the junior won't listen to his elder brother, what becomes of your argument? Besides, Chi's passions are like a whirlwind. He can argue until wrong becomes right. He is free with abuse. Keep away from him. I strongly advise you. Confucius paid no attention but with Yan Hui, his favorite disciple, for charioteer and Tzu Kung, a famous follower, on his left, went to Robert Chi. The robber was engaged in devouring a dish of minced human liver. Confucius alighted and addressed the doorkeeper. I am Confucius of Lu State. The high character of your captain has reached me. He then twice respectfully saluted the doorkeeper, who went in to announce him. When Robber Chi heard the name he was furious. His eyes glared like stars. His hair raised his cap. What? That crafty scoundrel, Confucius of Lu. Go, tell him he is a mere word-spinner. That he talks nonsense about the ancients. That he wears an extravagant cap with a thong from a dead ox. That his lips patter, and his tongue wags, and he throws dust in the eyes of rulers and prevents scholars from reverting to the original way. That he makes a great stir about filial piety, glad enough himself to secure some fat fief or post. Tell him if he does not take himself off, his liver shall be in my morning stew. Still Confucius repeated his wish, burning to evangelize the offender. I am anxious to set eyes upon your captain's shoestrings. A polite form of address. He was admitted and hurried in, avoiding the place of honor and making 2 obeisances. Robber Chi, flaming with fury, straddled out his 2 legs, laying his hand on his sword, and roaring like a tigress with young, said. Come here. If what you say suits me you shall live. Otherwise you shall die. I have heard, said Confucius, that there are 3 sorts of virtue. To be tall and beautiful and thus the idol of all. To be possessed of all-embracing wisdom. To be possessed of valor. A man with any one of those may rule, but you, captain, unite all 3. You are stately in stature. Your expression is radiant. Your lips are vermilion, your teeth like a row of shells. Your voice is sonorous as a beautiful bell. Yet you are known as Robber Chi. Captain, I blush for you. If you listen to me I will go south, north, east, and west for you. I will have a great wall built for you many li in length, enclosing a state which you shall rule. You shall disband your men, gather your kin about you and join in the worship of your ancestors. Such is the behavior of the true sage, and such is what the world needs. You come here with offers, cried Chi in a rage royal. Those who are squared by offers and corrected by preaching are the stupid, vulgar masses. The height and beauty you praise, my parents gave me, and do you suppose I am not well aware of them? All you promise about this fine state is simply squaring me, as though I were one of the common herd. And of course it would not last. Even with the empire and the heroes of old their posterity reigns no longer. In the olden days men lay down without caring where they were, and got up without worry as to where they would go. A man knew his mother but not his father. He lived among the animals, tilling the ground for good. He wove cloth to cover himself. He had no thought of injury to others. These were the results of an age of virtue. Since then we have had nothing but disturbers of the peace. And now you come along, preaching the old dogmas and palming off sophistries to teach posterity. You wear patched clothes and talk big and act falsely, while all the time you yourself are aiming at wealth and power. You are the biggest thief I know, and if men call me Robber Chi they should certainly call you Robber Chiu, the personal name of Confucius. As to the sermon you propose for me, if it is on spiritual subjects they are beyond me, and if on human affairs, I know it already. Now I'll tell you a few things. The lust of the eye is for beauty, the lust of the ear for music, the lust of the palate for flavor, the lust of ambition for power. Man's greatest age is 100 years. A medium age is 80. The lowest estimate is 60. Subtract the hours of sickness, death, mourning, and trouble, and there remain no more than 4 or 5 days a month in which a man can laugh. Heaven and earth are eternal, man must die. Seen against the eternal, the mortal is a mere flash, like the passage of a white horse seen through a crack. And those who cannot gratify their ambition and live through their span in doing so, are men who have not attained the law. All 4 teachings are nothing to me. Go home. Say no more. Your doctrine is full of falsity. It can never preserve the original purity of man. Confucius made 2 obeisances and hurried off. As he rode in his chariot he sometimes dropped the reins. His eyes were so dazed he could see nothing. His face was the color of slaked lime. With downcast head he grasped the bar of his chariot. Arrived outside the eastern gate of Lu, he met the brother of Robber Chi, who said, "I have not seen you for some days. From the look of your chariot I guess you have been traveling. Can you have been to see Chi?" Confucius looked up to heaven and sighed. "I have." "And did he not rebuff you as I said he would?" "He did," said Confucius. "I am a man who has cauterized himself without being ill. I hurried away to stroke the tiger's head and cut his whiskers and I nearly fell into his jaws." Here again we have the doctrine of inaction, and the assertion that even in an evil life consistently and gallantly carried out its strength is based on the maxims of the law and can be no other. And yet there are moments when the suspicion haunts me that the whole is an early Chinese parody on the teachings of both Confucius and Lao-Tsu. And that if Chuang-Tzu did not write it he would at least have read it with a smile in those deep eyes of his and with laughter on those very ironic lips. He has certainly no use for those who set out to uplift others. But his triumph in beauty of language and in philosophy is in a chapter known as Autumn Floods, considered by those in China who are best qualified to judge as one of the loveliest things they own in philosophic literature. As usual I must condense, but since I hope to send many to the company of Chuang-Tzu, who is my own constant companion, this will matter the less. It was the time of autumn floods. Every stream poured into the river, which swelled in its turbid course. The banks grew so far apart that it was impossible to tell a cow from a house. The spirit of the river shouted for joy that all the beauty of the earth was gathered to himself. Down with the stream he journeyed east until he reached the ocean. There, looking eastward and seeing no limit to its waves, his face fell. And as he gazed over the expanse he said to the spirit of ocean. A common proverb says that he who hears half the truth thinks no one equal to himself. And so it is with me. When formerly I heard people decrying the learning of Confucius or the heroism of I did not believe, but now that I see your vastness, if I had not reached your dwelling I should forever have been a laughing stock to those who know better. To this the ocean spirit replied. You cannot talk of the ocean to a frog in a well, the creature of narrow bounds. Nor of ice to summer flies, the ephemera of a day. You cannot speak of the law to a pedant. His limits are narrow. But now that you have emerged, that you have seen the great ocean, you know your narrowness, and I may speak of great principles. Nothing beneath heaven is greater than ocean. All water flows into it, yet it does not overflow. It is drained, yet does not empty. It knows no floods or droughts and thus is greater than mere rivers and brooks, though I, its spirit, dare not boast, for I get my shape from the universe, my vital power from the negative and positive principles governing all. In the universe I am as a little stone or a bush on a vast mountain. And of all who inhabit the earth man is but one. Is not he compared with all creation as the tip of a hair on a horse's skin? Well, then, replied the spirit of the river, and am I to consider the universe as great and the tip of a hair as small? By no means. Dimensions are limitless. Time has no bounds. Conditions vary. Terms are not final. How then can one say that a tip of hair is the last word on littleness or the universe the last word on vastness? Relativity again, the Buddhist philosophy in another form of relative truth which humanity can grasp, again relatively, with absolute truth forever beyond its reach. The whole chapter is a magnificent exposition of this and the other doctrines of the way written with exquisite discrimination from the literary point of view. Those who can should read it in the translation of Dr. Herbert Giles. That of Dr. Legge is more difficult to follow, except for those used to Chinese modes of expression. But it should be read. Chuang-Tzu is not only one of the great thinkers but one of the great writers of the world, and he carries conviction to those who read him that the Chinese can make their philosophies more interesting than any other people. The difficulty is that behind his ironic mask it is difficult to know whether there are smiles or tears, unless, indeed, one is of the same way of thinking. How is his anecdote of his wife's death and the effect on himself to be taken? Was it pure invention? Was it based on belief? Was it merely another flout and jeer at the Confucian attitude to death? Did it ever happen? Here it is, told, as it were, in the third person. When Chuang Tzu's wife died, a friend went to condole. He found the widower squatting on the ground, singing, with his legs spread out at a right angle and beating on a basin between them. When a wife has lived with her husband, cried the friend, and your eldest son is grown up and she dies, not to shed a tear is surely enough. But when you go on drumming on this basin and singing, it is surely a most excessive and singular demonstration. Chuang Tzu answered. It really is not. When first she died I could not help being troubled by the event. But then I remembered she had already existed before birth. She had neither form nor substance then. Substance was added to spirit and substance took on form, and she was born. And now change comes yet again, and she is dead. The relation between all this is like the procession of the four seasons. There now she lies with her face turned upward, sleeping in the great chamber of eternity. And while this is so, if I were to fall to weeping and sobbing I should think I was ignorant of the law of nature. I therefore restrain myself. So the book goes on to its wise close, giving many of the teachings of India seen through a brilliant Chinese mentality, which falling short of the soaring spirituality of India yet saw the universe luminous with a many-colored humor not easily to be found in the great Indian writings. Side by side with the ironic story of the pigs is set the lovely story of the old fisherman, rejected by some but accepted by Dr. Legge as true Chuang Tzu. Here are the pigs. Note the subtle irony. What is there to choose between the pigs and the officer of sacrifices, when all is said and done? The officer of prayer in his dark and square-cut robes approached the pig pen and thus addressed the pigs. How can you object to die? I shall feed you on grain for 3 months. Then for 10 days I shall fast, and keep vigil for 3 days, after which I shall strew white grass mats and place your members upon a carved sacrificial dish. Will not this please you? Then, speaking from the pig's point of view, he said. Really it is better to be fed with bran and chaff and live on in our pen. So, considering for himself also, he very much preferred to enjoy while he lived his carriage and cap of office, and after death to go to the grave in state with an ornamented carriage and canopy. But in what was he different from the pigs? I can give only enough of the old fisherman to kindle the desire for more. It begins with a picture beautiful as any in the range of Chinese art, and that is saying much. Confucius and his disciples have been journeying in the Black Forest. They are a little weary and stop to rest a while in the heat of the day by the apricot altar. The disciples get out their books. Time is precious, and life is short, and a wise man trained in the Confucian ethic will be up and doing every moment. His intellect shall not rest even if his body must. He is all for incessant improvement. Confucius elevates his soul with playing on his lute and singing to its accompaniment. He reflects with pleasure that this music of the ancients is a truly uplifting delight and that only the wise of heart can love it as it should be loved. Such is the scene. Halfway through the song an old fisherman stepped out of a boat and advanced toward them. His beard and eyebrows were snow white. His hair hung loose, and his great sleeves flapped. He came up the bank and stood with his left hand on his knee and the right to his ear listening. When the song ceased he beckoned to Tzu Kung and Tzu Lu, both of whom went to him. Then pointing with his finger he said, "What is that man?" Tzu Lu answered, "Why, that is the wise man of Lu." "Of what clan?" "Of the Kung family." "And what is his business?" "He devotes himself to loyalty and sincerity. He conducts his life with charity and righteousness. He cultivates the ornaments of ceremonies and music. He pays special attention to the social relationships. Loyal to his ruler he seeks the transformation of the masses, his object being to benefit the empire." "Is he a territorial lord?" asked the stranger, "or a minister?" "Neither," said Tzu Kung. The old man laughed and turned away. "Yes, charity is charity, yet I fear he will not escape the wear and tear of mind and body which imperil the true nature. Alas, how far has he wandered from the way? Naturally Confucius must speak with him when he hears this. He is persuaded the old man is a sage, and he follows and finds him as he is drawing his boat in with a staff. He prostrates himself twice before the ancient wisdom and begs instruction. He is met with the doctrine of the immutable peace of the way as compared with his own fussy little activities. And when he laments the sorrows of his life. "Dear me," says the old man in a vexed tone. "How slow of perception you are. You are like the man who was so afraid of his own shadow that he was always running away from it. He pelted along without resting, and his strength broke and he died. It never occurred to him that by going into the shade he could easily get rid of the shadow." And from this the teacher leads on to the great teaching of the peace. Leave externals. What are ceremonies? The invention of man. Real mourning weeps in silence. The true essentials are there always. The kingdom of heaven is within. You have but to recognize it and look upon the beginnings of peace. So it is expounded, and Confucius prostrates himself twice, then rising entreats to follow the mysterious stranger as his servant. "I have heard," says the old man, "that if a man is a fit companion one may travel with him into the very heart of the way. But if not, excuse me, I must leave you." He gets into his boat, pushes it off and is lost among the tall reeds. Confucius, himself an old man, returns sorrowfully to his disciples, to be reproached for such amazing submission. He replies with solemnity. "The law is the source of all creation. Men have it and live. They lose it and die. The old fisherman had the law. Dared I presume not to show him reverence?" And they stand thinking, pondering, while the boat drifts slowly away far and far among the reeds, which sway in unison with the law. We shall end, where in reality a story begins, with the death of Chuang-Tzu. It has his old irony mingled with the grandeur that never forsook his thoughts. His disciples, determined to give him a grand burial, seem to have essayed to gladden him with the prospect. He replied, "I shall have heaven and earth for my coffin and shell, the sun and moon for my 2 jade jewels, the great and ancient constellations for my pearls, and all creation to lead me to the grave. Are not the provisions for my burial made?" But the disciples were not satisfied. "We fear lest the crows and kites should devour the body of our master." To which Chuang-Tzu rejoined, "Above ground the crows and kites will devour me. Below, the moles, crickets, and ants. To take from those and give to these is scarcely impartial." Thus like the old fisherman he fades into the mists of time, remote, yet the most modern-minded of men, the highest follower of Lao-Tsu, the great master of the law. One should not conclude with death but with the living and immortal words he wrote. "O my exemplar, thou who destroyest all things and dost not account it cruelty, thou who benefitest all time and dost not count it charity. Thou who art older than antiquity and dost not count it age, thou who supportest the universe and dost not account it skill, this is the bliss of God." For such a man the word death has no meaning. Would he not have smiled with even finer irony had he known the relative fates of his teaching and that of Confucius, at whom he often mocked so subtly but always with a humor precluding unkindness? There is an irony of destiny even more subtle than that of Chuang-Tzu. The Confucian teaching made its appeal to the average man. It set before him a standard that he could console himself by attempting to follow even if he were not likely to master its full perfection of ceremony and emotion. He could feel that it was emphatically the right thing, good form, a thing all decent men must commend and to decry which partook of the nature of sin. And also that if rightly followed it would lead, as a famous Don once said of the study of Greek, to positions of emolument in this world and the next. The higher flights of spirituality in it were likely to escape him, because it was so heavily robed and shod with the ceremonial garments of this world. It spread over China, a great light but also a great gospel of respectability. It was perceived by teachers and literary men to be a bulwark of law and order, by emperors to be a guarantee of empire. And so the ethic of Confucius was absorbed into China, and he became her lifeblood and her soul. As for the teachings of Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu, they were for the few, the seers, the dreamers of dreams. Of these there is a worldwide company throughout the ages, but not many at any given time. Those who love the way love it with a passion that outflares all else, but they will be mostly silent, not even expansive to each other. The cup of their lips will be the chalice of the grapes of God. And that cup stands in the sanctuary and is the grail whether in China or the West. In this manner and in such hands the flame of the way was and is kept alive in China. But it had another great development. The aim of the teaching of Lao-Tsu and his great disciple was to fuse the spiritual and what we call the material, and this being also one of the aims of art, the influence of Taoism on art in China was enormous. It appeared as a revelation to Chinese artists. Reinforced later by the cognate teachings of Buddhism, it created the mighty schools of landscape and portraiture in which China sits supreme. It thus perpetuated the perfect spiritual rhythm which all who experience it will perceive in the way, reacting to it as the seaweed reacts to the motion of the vast swell that lifts it. That is life, that is vital rhythm. That is the gift of the great Taoist school of thought in China. Volumes might and should be written on this magnificent subject, which I can only touch in passing. Spiritually Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu molded the greatest in China and through China, in Japan. They had drunk the milk of paradise, and it became the food of nations. Yet there was another side to the teaching of the way, one fatally certain to popularize itself in the hands of the baser sort. Chuang-Tzu had dwelt on the powers open to the attainment of the man who became a conscious part in the rhythm of the universal. He spoke as the Buddha, the Christ, and other mighty teachers have spoken, with a profound sense of the selfless truths he uttered, but not perhaps so necessary a sense as theirs of the danger of such a teaching in the hands of the uninstructed. The Christ was no lover of miracles, the Buddha foresaw and dreaded their results. Chuang-Tzu issues no caution that I can remember. The inevitable happened. Notions of magic multiplied like blotched fungus in the fair soil of Taoist teachings. The charlatan, the sly priest, the fanatic, the lunatic, all the brood we know very well in the West staked out their claims on that ground, and according to their powers cheated emperors and people. Until today that degraded Taoism is an officially endowed superstition in China. The best perverted is certainly the worst. It cannot be said there is no good even in that. Such salt could not wholly lose its savor, nor such high spirituality wholly decay. But once as I sat in a Taoist temple watching the priests, gloriously habited in crimson with golden dragons and symbols embroidered on cope and robe, gliding to and fro, performing their fantastic charms, evocations and exorcisms. With woven paces and with waving hands, the fumes of incense and the dim gliding possessed my brain. And for a moment I saw through them the little boat of the old fisherman drifting away into the reeds, and beheld his face radiant with understanding of the simplicity and unity of the whole universe and the beyond, as he rode to its rhythm. God possessed, himself a spirit of nature. What these yellow-capped Taoists believe and teach now can have no place here. It is far indeed from philosophy. And yet it must be said there have gone with it through the centuries poetry and romance that have done much for Chinese literature. It has made a fairyland of myth and legend, full of loveliness, sometimes perverse, sometimes grim, always immaterial. Thus it still holds aside the curtain of the world invisible, and the three precious ones, the three giant images in the Taoist temples, have a glimmer of the beautiful and even the spiritual to minds unfitted for more. The work of Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu was not wasted. The seed is living, and the fruit will take its place in the great treasury of thought that Asia is now opening to Europe. Chapter 27. Mencius, the Guide of Princes. It is impossible to leave Chinese philosophy without reviewing the work of the great disciple of Confucius who is known in Europe as Mencius. Just as it would have been impossible to do justice to Lao-Tsu without a full account of Chuang-Tzu, so when Confucius is discussed Mencius cannot be ignored. Mencius is the Latinized form of Meng-Tzu, the philosopher Meng. He sprang from one of the great and turbulent noble houses of the state of Lu, whose rebellious spirit troubled Confucius and so often caused his exile. He also was born in Shantung, in 371 BC. 108 years after the death of Confucius, and he lived to be 84 years old. Dr. Legge points out that his life synchronized with the last half of Plato's and that Aristotle, Zeno, Epictetus, Demosthenes, and other great Greeks were his contemporaries. It is singular that spiritual and intellectual light appears to come to the world in rhythmic waves, like the rising and ebbing of tides, differentiated into the various colors of the white light that is alike art and truth. Thus Confucius was contemporary with the Buddha and Lao-Tsu. The explanation of this fact would be interesting. Mencius had a remarkable mother, and since this is recorded in Chinese chronicles she must have been remarkable indeed. She is still honored in China as the example of what a mother should be. Her name was Changsha. The stories tell us that his father died when Mencius was 3 years old and that his mother was left in narrow circumstances, the right training for a thinker if rightly turned to account. Their first house had a burial place in full view, and the child, imitative as a monkey, amused himself with acting all he saw, the ceremonial, the formal grief, and so forth. To this his mother strongly objected. "This is no place for my son," she said, and changed her house to one in the marketplace. But with no improvement. The chaffering and trading caught the boy's fancy, the untruthful boasting of the wares by the seller and equally untruthful depreciation by the customer. Those who know the Orient can very well figure the scene. Again the boy's fancy was caught, and he imagined it the purpose of life. "And this will not do," said his mother, and patiently moved again, this time to a house close by a school. Here the little Mencius observed the gravity of carriage and formal ceremonial ritual which the scholars were taught according to the Confucian ideal. "This will do," said his watchful mother. "This is the proper place for my son." And there they settled. It is to be imagined from the following story that they could not afford meat for their food. Not far from their house was a butcher, and Mencius asked his mother for what reason they killed the pigs. She answered, "To feed you." But on reflection she did not find this a perfectly truthful answer. She thought, "While my boy was yet unborn I would not sit down if the mat were not placed square. I would eat no meat which was not properly cut. I taught him before birth. And now that his intelligence unfolds I deceive him. This would be to teach him the spirit of deceit." Therefore she went out and bought a piece of meat to make good her words, and that day the little Mencius feasted. In China this belief in influencing the unborn child was highly commended. There is a book by Chu Hai which begins with the education of the unborn child by the mother. If a mother's thoughts are fixed and directed to the one goal it is difficult to believe the child will not be influenced during that time of union. I have known a very few, Western mothers who held this creed, not only from the physical but from the intellectual and psychic point of view, and who were rewarded. It may be said this was heredity, that the woman who could argue thus must have a character likely to be transmitted. Possibly, but who can gauge the dynamic of conscious will? We understand its marvels very little as yet. In his schooldays Mencius' wise mother was somewhat disappointed with his progress. He came in one day as she was spinning, and when she asked how far he had gone he answered carelessly that he was doing well enough. Instantly she took a knife and cut her thread. This startled him, and he asked timidly what she meant. "What I mean is that what I have just done you are doing, cutting the thread which makes the web of life, destroying all hope of utility and beauty. That is what neglecting education means. No less." It went home. He realized her meaning, and she had no need to complain again of his carelessness. We see the same wide point of view later on in this remarkable Chinese woman, and this time in a path where many women fail. Mencius married, and apparently, as seems to be the way of philosophers, his wife did not wholly please him. Perhaps the philosophic ideal of perfection is higher than the average man's. At all events he came in one day unexpectedly and found his wife in her own room sitting on the floor, and resenting this informality and carelessness in a woman who should be acquainted with the rites. went straight to his mother and told her that he meant to put his wife away as one who did not value the rules of propriety. No doubt he expected full sympathy from a mother who not only loved her son but was herself an example of all a Chinese lady should be. But he was disappointed. She was one who could look from the particular to the general. She answered, "It is you who have no sense of the fitting and not your wife. What do the rules of propriety say? When you are about to enter a hall, raise your voice. When you enter a room, keep your eyes low. And the reason of this is that people may not be caught at a disadvantage. Now, you walked into the private room without raising your voice, and so caused your wife to be caught. The fault is yours, not hers." And Mencius saw the truth of this, and his anger was at an end. One day she noticed the grief of her son's expression as he stood leaning against a pillar, and asked him the reason of it. He answered, "As I think, in a way likely to wound a mother who had been all to him. I have heard that the princely man should hold the place that suits him, taking no reward which is not justly his and being not covetous of praise and riches. Well, what I teach is not practiced in Chi, and I long to leave it, but I think of your old age and I hesitate." There is a touch of love, a little hurt in her dignified reply. It is not a woman's part to determine anything of herself, for she is subject to the rule of the three obediences. When young she must obey her parents. Married, her husband. As a widow, her son. You are a man in full maturity. I am old. Act as your conviction of righteousness directs, and I shall act according to the rule that is mine. Why should you be anxious about me? It is clear that Mencius had thus the best education at home and fitness for his great career. As for his outer education, he himself says he studied with the disciples of Confucius, and the Chinese historian whom I have mentioned before, Sima Chien, says he worked with the disciples of that famous philosopher who was the grandson of Confucius. This being so, it is no wonder that he held and carried on the Confucian tradition in perfection, nor can it surprise any to miss in him the infinite speculations and beliefs of Lao-Tsu and Chuang. But the Confucian teaching needed much renewal, and Mencius came at the moment when he could do vital work in practical reconstruction of a very high ideal. For China had gone through nightmares of civil war and dissension since the death of Confucius. The feudal system had sunk into chaos, from which it scarcely seemed society could be reconstructed. The imperial dynasty of Chao had weakened so that it was helpless, while the larger states devoured the smaller. Two ruling princes would unite to ruin a third, then dissolve the bond in quarrels between themselves. Bands of robbers roamed the country. Adventurous men sold their swords to whoever would pay most. What room was there for philosophy or for any consideration of the basis of life? It was hard enough to live at all. Wild doctrines gained ground and the Confucian ideal was half forgotten. Mencius comments upon all this, and his voice is almost the voice of despair. Wise kings arise no longer, and the ruling princes give rein to their lusts. Scholars indulge in foolish discussions. Yang's principle is, every man for himself. Maya's principle is to love all equally, which certainly does not acknowledge the special love due to a father. He felt that vague principles of universal benevolence, the Buddhist teaching, are often a very easy way of compromising with non-fulfillment of the special and primal obligations of duty to parents and to the ruler. And as to the principle of every man for himself, Mencius points to the result in burning words. In those of another wise man he describes the rulers. In their kitchens there is fat meat. In their stables are fat horses, but the people are famine-pinched, and in the wilds lie the starved bodies of the dead. If, says Mencius, the principles of Yang and Mai are not checked, and the Confucian principles set forth, these perverse teachings will delude the people and block the path of benevolence and righteousness. Beasts will devour men and men will devour one another. Accordingly, to reform vice was the task Mencius set himself, and following to a certain extent the example of Confucius, he resolved to influence the ruling princes where and when he could. It is a difficult task to touch pitch and keep clean hands, as Chuang-Tzu had pointed out again and again. Mencius could not stand the ordeal wholly unspotted. There were occasions when he laid himself open to the charge of inconsistency and even of flattery, for though on the whole his character stands out in bright light against a stormy background, there were littlenesses also which made him human. As they illustrate the life of ancient China, they are sometimes amusing and worth recording. Here is one that might have happened yesterday, and I give it because his entry into the state of Qi, invited by the ruling prince, is typical. The illustrious, as this prince is called, had sent to make private inquiry as to what manner of man the new philosopher might be. This was followed by an invitation, but the outlook was so hopeless that Mencius, though he remained and took office, kept his hands free by declining any salary. This movement was evidently viewed with alarm, for the Prime Minister sent him a handsome gift to ingratiate himself. Mencius accepted the gift but made no visit of gratitude according to usage. There was a gift, he said, but no corresponding respect. Why should he step out of his way to acknowledge it? But the illustrious received him honorably and held many long conferences with him on the means of good government. And here one may doubt the wisdom of one of his methods in dealing with these people of importance. It would have been scarcely possible to Confucius and absolutely impossible to Lao-Tsu and Chuang. The prince in stating his difficulties said frankly, "I have a lust for beauty and surely that stands in the way of my attaining to the royal government you advocate." Mencius replied with philosophic calm, "Not in the least. Gratify yourself, only do not let your doing so interfere with the people's similar pleasures." Even the most devout of his disciples were a little startled by this. Naturally his aim was to bring the prince to recognize the claim of the people, when it might be hoped his own reformation would follow. But the sequence is rather more than doubtful. Perhaps it was the natural consequence of this system of compromise that suspicion characterized the relations of the illustrious and the philosopher. There does not appear to have been real confidence and respect. Here is an amusing instance of the wariness of two formalists, each trying to get the better of the other. Once Mencius was dressing in the robes suitable for a visit to court when the prince sent word that he had intended to receive him but had taken cold. Would Mencius come to the audience next day? Instantly Mencius suspects that cold. It is a carefully laid plan of the prince's to evade the courtesy of receiving him, and philosophers have their dignity to keep up and must not be slighted. He sends back word that he is unwell and cannot have that pleasure. Then carefully and ostentatiously goes out next morning to pay a visit of condolence, supposing the prince will send to ask after his health and receive the wholesome snub of hearing he has gone out visiting. But mark how all this carefully built house of cards tumbles at a breath. The prince sent indeed, but a blundering, good-natured cousin, willing to smooth the matter for the ear of royalty, said eagerly to the envoy. He was better and so he hurried off to court. I doubt whether he has got there by now. And runners were sent rushing after the peevish philosopher to urge him to go to court at once. But still his wounded dignity stood in the way, and still this important matter agitated the court circles. The indignant Mencius avoided both home and court at last, and betook himself to sleep at the house of a great official, who dashed into the fray by accusing Mencius of calculated disrespect to the prince. He angrily rejoined, "Not so. It is I and I only who bring high and royal subjects to his notice." "That isn't what I mean at all," said the other. "The rule is that when the prince's order calls the carriage must not wait. You were going to court, but would not when you heard the royal message. This does not seem in accordance with the rights, I think." Mencius replied on general principles that a ruler who did not honor the virtuous was really not worth having anything to do with, illustrating his position by examples from history which drowned all remonstrances, and so remained victorious. The storm in a teacup ended but had left its mark, and before long he prepared to depart from the state. Then the prince made another proposal, conscious that an insult to such a sage would not reflect any honor upon himself. Would he stay if he were given a house large enough for himself and his disciples and an allowance of 10,000 measures of grain to support them? A very handsome allowance indeed, but an insult in the philosopher's opinion. They had not understood him. They believed wealth could buy wisdom, a thing impossible in its very nature. Mencius rose in true and worthy anger. Could they suppose he would sell himself, he who had already refused a salary worth 100,000 measures of grain? Not he. So he left Xi, but slowly, sadly, as Confucius had once left Lu, hoping against hope to be recalled upon honorable terms. Some of his disciples thought even this hope unworthy of his dignity, but he replied, "You do not understand. The illustrious is a man with good in him. If he were to use me it would be for the happiness of more than the state of Qi, even for the empire. I am hoping he may change. Daily I hope this. I will not be little-minded. Little-minded people get angry and go off in a huff. So will not I." But he was not recalled, and he settled for a while in Honan. There a distinction awaited him, a visit from the heir apparent of Tang, who had made a long journey for the purpose. They talked at length and earnestly on the antique wisdom and the teachings of Confucius, and still the prince admired, and still he doubted whether such exalted views were applicable to daily experience. But he went away almost persuaded to be a philosopher, and later invited Mencius to Tang and lavished large gifts on him, as did other princes, and yet could not at all use him. The net result appears to have been a magnificent display of mourning ceremonial when his father died, in which the profound knowledge of Mencius as to ceremonial was strictly followed. This obtained great reputation for the prince, but can hardly have bettered the condition of his people. Thus the saddened philosopher wandered through more than one principality, scattering seeds by the wayside, which fell upon barren ground. There was little public opinion to support him, and it was easier for the princes to follow the line of least resistance and lose themselves in sensual pleasures and in war, when it became inevitable, than to climb the heights which few understood. He met with censure here and there, sometimes because his spirit of compromise offended consciences formed in the Confucian school, sometimes unjustly because his disinterestedness was real and profound. Then his mother died. She had followed him to the state of Qi, and he took her coffin with such magnificent ceremony to Lu to bury it near his father that even his disciples remonstrated at the cost. But he was not likely to lose such an opportunity for displaying both knowledge and affection, and his reply was, "The noble-minded man will never be niggardly to his parents. And since I have the means and the will, why should I not do all I can to express my feelings?" One is conscious of an opinion that Changshi's own calm good sense might have rejected such extravagance. But it is not for the West to judge China in such matters. The springs of filial piety differ there and here. A triumph was to come however which gladdened him, so that for joy he could not sleep. A disciple of his, Yo Ching, was given the administration of the government of the state of Lu, the state famous as the birthplace of Confucius, and Mencius rejoiced in the hope of seeing his ideals translated into action. He followed Yo Ching to Lu, impatient, eager, and transfigured with joy. The ruling prince was stepping into his carriage to welcome the coming philosopher, and all the horizon was roseate, when a worthless favorite dissuaded him. "Do not go to him, my prince." And the prince, no doubt glad to get out of it, ordered his carriage away, and the visit was never paid. After his long wanderings and fleeting hopes, Mencius took this as a definite ruling from heaven that the time was not come when his work should be established. "Heaven does not yet wish that the empire should rejoice in tranquility and good government," he said, and knew as he said it that life does not stand still and that he was growing old. He had given his best to effort, and effort had failed. Heaven knew best. He would submit and would toil no more with the ungrateful princes. Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone, as said a prophet of Israel. And then and there suddenly and pathetically Mencius disappears. No more is known of him among the great courts and officials. He had tried the world, and it had tricked him. And this though he had given of the best that was in him, and the flaws in the jewel of his purpose were small indeed in comparison with its radiance. He might at least console himself with the reflection that Confucius, whom he almost worshipped, had fared little better at the hands of men. Therefore he withdrew, probably, it is thought, to calm reflection and teaching among his disciples. The last years of such a man could hardly fail to be serene and to influence others profoundly, but their all knowledge of him ends. China has marked her gratitude to a great son. The man 56th in descent from Mencius was made a member of the great Han Lin College and of the board in charge of the 5 great classics. This honor was made hereditary in his family, and after his death he was created Duke of Cao. His tablet stands in the temple near that of Confucius. But far more than this are the honors received from those who knew and could appreciate the value of his influence in the empire. It is owing to his words, says one, that learners now know how to revere Confucius, to honor benevolence and righteousness, to esteem the sovereign and despise the mere pretender. The merit of Mencius in regard to the teaching of the great sages is more than can be told, another says. And to his undying glory it is Mencius who enunciated the great principle. The people are the most important element in a country. The ruler is the lightest. That may seem a truism. It was very far from being a truism in China in his day. He went further, and with amazing courage. The Prince of Qi once asked him, "May a minister put his sovereign to death?" Instancing the case of the great Prince Wu who slaughtered his sovereign, the last of the house of Cao, a most unworthy ruler, an abandoned tyrant, the very essence of wickedness. Mencius replied, "He who outrages benevolence is called a robber. He who outrages righteousness is called a ruffian. In the case you mention I have heard of the cutting off of a robber and a ruffian, the fellow Cao, but I never have heard that Prince will put a true sovereign to death." Such was the ruling of Cromwell and his associates when confronted, with only incapacity in Charles I. Such also was the ruling of the terrorists in the French Revolution in dealing with Louis XVI. Such again was the decision of the Bolshevists in dealing with the Tsar. It is not difficult to realize what Mencius would have decreed in such cases, but in all three the result has been to exalt the man from sovereignty to martyrdom. It is evident there are arguments on both sides. Yet his conclusion was, "Heaven sees according as the people see. Heaven hears as the people hear." This is the teaching of democracy. Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu would have questioned it sharply, but theirs was a high and spiritual gospel, above the reach of any but highly evolved spirits. Chapter 28. The Guidebook for Princes. Such was the life of Mencius. His philosophy, while founded upon the rock of Confucius, was nevertheless so far original that it built its own castle, especially in relation to good government and to certain aspects of individual character. One of these was the tender and paternal love a ruler should bear to all his people, and this was developed by Mencius with illustrations that would not have occurred to Confucius. Here is an example from one of those celebrated conversations, which might indeed be called lessons for princes. This especial one was with the ruling Prince of Qi, who had asked, "Is such a one as poor I competent to love and guard the people?" "Undoubtedly, yes." "And how do you know this, sir?" "Because I have heard the following story. Your Majesty was sitting in the hall when people led past a bull. Your Majesty saw it and asked where the bull was going, and being answered that they were going to consecrate a bell with its blood said, 'Let it go free.' I cannot bear its frightened face as if it were an innocent person going to the place of death. They asked whether the consecration of the bell should be omitted. Your Majesty said, 'How can it be omitted? Take a sheep.' I do not know if this really happened." "It happened," said the prince. Mencius replied, "The heart seen in this is sufficient to carry you to royal heights. The people supposed that your Majesty grudged the animal. I, your servant, know surely that it was your Majesty's pain at the sight of the creature's distress." "You are right. How should I grudge a bull? Indeed it was because I could not bear its terror." Then said Mencius, "Let not your Majesty deem it strange that the people grudged it. When you changed a large animal for a small one, how should they guess the reason? If you felt pained, what was there to choose between a bull and a sheep? It was an artifice of benevolence. You saw the bull and had not seen the sheep. So is the man of high virtue touched with the suffering of animals. Having seen them living, he cannot bear to see them die. Having heard their dying cries, he cannot bear to eat their flesh. The prince was pleased and said. The ode says. What is in other men's mind? I can guess by reflecting. And so it is with you, my master. When I turned my mind inward I could not analyze it. But as you spoke now the movement of compassion stirred in my heart. But what has my heart in it equal to the royal heights? Said Mencius. Here is kindness extended to animals, yet no benefit to the people. How is this? The mercy is not used for them. Your Majesty's falling short of the royal heights is because you will not climb, not because you cannot. The prince asked how these things should be done. Mencius answered with an echo of his idol Confucius. Treat with reverence the aged in your own family, so that those in the families of others should receive reverence. Treat with kindness the young in your own family. Do this and thus, and the kingdom may be encircled in your palm. It is said in the Book of Odes. His example swayed his wife. It spread abroad to his brethren. And was a guide to all clans and states. Thus it tells us how the good King Wu simply realized his kindly heart and used it for the service of all. Now if your Majesty will institute a government whose action shall all be benevolent, there is not an official but will wish to stand in your court, not a farmer but will long to plough your fields, not a merchant, traveling or stationary, but will wish to store his goods in your Majesty's marketplaces. And all under heaven who suffer from their rulers will wish to lay their wrongs at your feet. The prince said, I am not quick in intelligence. I cannot advance to this. But, my master, assist my intentions. Teach me clearly. I should like to try. Said Mencius, the livelihood of the people is now so regulated that they have not the wherewithal to serve their parents nor to support their wives and children. Their only hope is to escape from death, and they fear they cannot do even this. What leisure have they for manners or virtue? Turn back then to the practical steps. Let mulberry trees be planted about the homesteads with their 5 acres, and people of 50 years can be clothed in silk. In keeping domestic birds and animals, let not their proper times of breeding be neglected, and old people can taste flesh. Let not there be taken away the time necessary for cultivation of the field allotment, and a family of 8 mouths will not suffer from hunger. Let careful education be given in the various schools, and let repeated emphasis be laid upon the filial and fraternal duties, and we shall no longer see grey-haired men upon the roads bent under the burdens on their backs and heads. It is impossible that the ruler of a state where the aged could wear silk and taste flesh, and the black-haired people did not suffer from hunger and cold, should not have attained to the royal heights. Note the tact and grace with which the prince is led on to realize the virtue in himself if he will but use it. Here Mencius fills the office of a true courtier, for he lacks neither rightful courage nor courtesy. I give another example of real philosophy. Will you allow your servant to speak to your Majesty about music? Your Majesty is having music here. The people hear the sound of your bells and drums, the sweetness of your reeds and flutes. And they all with aching heads frown and say, that's how our prince loves music. But why does he reduce us to this extremity of misery? Father and sons cannot see one another, older and younger brothers, wives and children, are scattered abroad. Again your Majesty hunts here. The people hear the noise of your carriages and horses and see the beauty of your plumes and pennons, and they all with aching brows say, that's how our prince loves hunting, but we are miserable. And this is because you do not care for the people's happiness as well as your own. Your Majesty has music here. Now if the people hearing the music could say with joyful looks, that sounds as if our prince were rejoicing in health. What splendid music! What splendid hunting, it would be because you considered their pleasure as well as your own. So if your Majesty will make happiness a thing common to the people as to yourself, royal heights await you. Thus Mencius draws a lesson from the prince's passion for music, as he drew it later from his passion for valor, and in this is seen the true democracy of the Chinese spirit. There have always been fearless men to tell the sovereign's home truths, even when their own lives were at stake and not infrequently paid the forfeit. Even the terrible old dowager empress of the Boxer riots had high-minded courtiers who, following the great examples of Confucius and Mencius, placed before her the ancient way. Those laws of which Sophocles wrote. The power of heaven is mighty in them and groweth not old. The great learning of Mencius, described as infinite, gave him an advantage before which the prince trembled, knowing that all China venerates the sage, even if his birth be the lowliest of the lowly. Therefore, with very few exceptions Mencius spoke his mind fearlessly, and was at his best and highest in so doing. He delighted after the manner of Confucius in the odes, and enriched his discourses with frequent quotations from them, regarding music and poetry as integral parts of the government of a cultured state. But all was used to drive home the lesson of caring for the good of the people, and in so doing he often gives a most interesting picture of ancient China. For instance, the prince said, as another had said, "I have a weakness. I am unluckily devoted to beauty." Said Mencius, "Long ago King Tai was devoted to beauty and loved his wife." It is said in the Book of Odes. The ancient Duke Tan Fu came in the morning galloping his horses along the bank of the western river. And there he and the lady Qiang came together and looked out a site on which to settle. At that time in the seclusion of the house were no discontented women and abroad no unmarried men. If your majesty is fond of beauty, let the people be able to gratify the same love, and what shall stand between you and the royal heights? But here again the disciples were inclined to look a little askance at this compromise. He could, however, rebuke like a Jewish prophet when there was need. Or rather, what is better, compel a tyrant to rebuke himself after this fashion. Suppose one of your majesty's servants trusted his wife and children to the care of a friend and went a long journey in Su, and on returning found the friend had caused them to suffer from cold and hunger, what should he do? The prince said, he should cast him off. And suppose the chief criminal judge could not regulate the officers of justice under him, what then? He should be dismissed, said the prince. Then said Mencius, and suppose that within the four borders of your kingdom there is no good government, what then? The prince looked to the right and left, and spoke of other matters. Thus we see in Mencius a touch of the heroic, which was perhaps a little lacking in Confucius. Confucius hesitated, for instance, to declare boldly what the doom of a worthless sovereign should be. He dwelt on the virtues of Yao and Shun, and permitted those who heard to draw the inference. Mencius had no such scruples. He was an Elijah denouncing doom to Ahab, and whatever the risks might be he took them. He stated clearly what the means of removal should be. The Prince of Sui questioned him on that point. I beg to ask about the chief ministers, who are noble and relatives to the ruler. What should they do in such a case? Mencius replied, if the ruler has great faults they should remonstrate with him, and if he do not listen to them when they have done so repeatedly they should appoint another in his place. The prince on this looked moved and changed countenance. Mencius noticed it, he said. Let not your majesty think what I say strange. You ask me, and what could I do but reply truthfully? But because in him as in all deep thinkers there must needs be a strain of the mystic he envisaged another solution, the belief that in the last resort heaven would provide the right man to fill the place of a degraded ruler. He might be of humble birth. He must not raise the flag of rebellion but of righteousness, and Mencius with his belief in the innate goodness of human nature was assured that men would flock to him. Therefore, since in his time the imperial house of Chow had so debased itself, his effort was to stir one if not more of the feudal princes to noble revolt against a weak licentious tyranny, exactly as the kings Wen and Wu, the heroes of Confucius, had done in the great old days. He could not succeed but the effort remains memorable. So he preached nobility of life, and love of the people, believing that greater results would follow from this than the rulers could gain by oppression. And that following this rule one of them would develop power and strength to trample down the Chow dynasty. If among the present rulers throughout the kingdom there was one who loved benevolence, all the other rulers would aid him by driving their people to him. Even if he did not wish to exercise the royal sway, he could not avoid it, he said. But first the people must have comfort. They must be raised above the rank of beasts to that of the natural hopes of humanity. And then they must be educated. Without the latter, the former must be a danger. In the view of Mencius, the goal of education is only to illustrate the human relationships. Book learning was the last thing he sought. He was certain that those who needed and were capable of that would naturally gravitate toward it. For the mass of the people, the interlocking of human social relationships was all that was needed. That was the true education, to lead men from a selfish individuality to consideration of the good of others as part of their own. He knew that when life is brutal in its surroundings there is no room for these possibilities, and therefore material necessities came first with him. Chuang-Tzu would have said, "Yes, but man can relinquish these voluntarily and gladly when he has reached a higher stage of spiritual development." This Mencius did not affirm, but it is almost implicit in his teaching. He was extremely modern in appreciation of the fact that everywhere must be a division of labor, each man doing that for which he is best fitted, the gospel of specialization. The business of the handicrafts, man can by no means carry along with that of husbandry. Great men have their proper business, little men, theirs. Hence the saying, some labor with their hands, some with their strength. Those who labor with their minds govern others. Those who are governed by others support them, those who govern others are supported by them. This is a universal principle. Mencius, like Lao-Tsu and Confucius, insisted upon the golden rule. And surely it may be taken as a strong testimony of its universal truth in human nature that teachers so far apart in time, place, and race as Confucius, the Buddha, the Christ, and others, should all have borne witness to its vital necessity to any true life of the spirit. Benevolence to others is the keynote of all the teaching of Mencius. His doctrine of what he calls the passion nature is interesting also. Man has the driving force of his passion nature, but the will, the active force of the will to goodness, is to guide and direct it. He does not desiderate the suppression of the passion nature as do some of the philosophies of India. He considers it a useful horse for the chariot of the soul if it is drilled, disciplined, and tamed by the heaven-directed will. There is a difference here which, though it may appear small at first, may be what has rendered India weak and passive even in her own great teachings, and China virile, haughty, dignified, in holding and proclaiming her own views in the face of the world. On great example he dwelt as Confucius had done and as all the faiths must needs do. The sages, perfectly exhibiting human relations, were the model. Let men form themselves on that. Just as no skill of hand could form circles and squares without compass and square, so without great examples virtue could not survive. And again, in a strangely beautiful sentence, anticipating the teaching of Christ and the mystics, and joining hands, though that he could not know, with his great countryman Chuang-Tzu, Mencius says, "The great man is he who never loses the heart of a child." That sentence will bear much pondering. With it we may leave one of the greatest of the philosophers of China, a man not perfect, but wise with a great wisdom. A seer with percipience which was to enkindle vision in his own people, in days when many supposed it dead and burned with the ashes of Confucius. Chapter 29. Buddhist Thought and Art in China and Japan. The Teachings of Zen. A few words on the position of Buddhist philosophy in China and Japan must end our survey. In the philosophies of Lao-Tsu, Confucius, Chuang-Tzu, and Mencius, no one charted road was indicated that could lead a man beyond earthly hopes to the hope man will never relinquish. Confucius had marked a path that promised the best type of prosperity in this world, but he, like Virgil with Dante, was obliged to lay down his guideship at the portals of heaven. There he did not attempt to enter. It was the same with Mencius. Both conceived they had done all that was possible in setting men on the road which must lead at last to knowledge of the truth. They did not realize with Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu the sudden flash that strikes some men awake in an instant to all the issues of life and death. And indeed it was true that such teachings were fitted only for men so highly evolved that they needed no guidance, and that for others of the lower type they must be dangerous. So it proved. The rebound of mysticism is magic, and in baser hands the teachings of Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu degenerated into superstition. They too had indicated no certain road. The truth was vague as a mountain in mists. China accordingly needed a middle way her own teachers had not given, a faith which should incorporate the spiritual with the material, the world as they saw it with the world as it might be believed to be. She desired spiritual sanction for the moral teachings her sages had given her, and most of all she craved for spiritual romance. That, to the world at large, is the essence of the great faiths. Their philosophies lie beyond the reach of the masses. Their romance invites all to the spiritual adventure. There lie the flowery ways, the cloud-capped towers not built by mortal hands, there, beyond the utmost starry peaks, lies the city of God. Religion and philosophy can never be dissevered. Religion is alike the philosophy of the highest and the romance of the lowest, according to their different stages. It is the comment of every man on life, and inevitably much more than that to great minds. For this reason Buddhism was welcomed in China. It is said to have come first in the dream of an emperor. He beheld in sleep the golden image of a man, and on inquiring learned that such a religion as it symbolized existed. But apart from all this, Buddhism was certain sooner or later to pass along the trade routes, which have been the conduits of so much beside trade. It was sure of a reception in independent democratic China that would contrast with the slowly chilling Indian belief, damped and wounded as it was at every point by what may be called the strong trade unionism of Brahmin interests, which knew so well how to exploit its affinity with them. When it arrived it was under the two forms already described in the section on Buddhism, the Hinayana, lesser vehicle, and the Mahayana, greater vehicle. The first was the stern, august philosophic system set forth in the Buddha's great teachings, impervious to scientific attack. Drawing to itself the highest spiritual forms of mentality that could be founded on the doctrines of the Upanishads divested of their earlier and more childish speculations. The second was the decorated palace which the minds of schoolmen and theologians had built on the rock of the Buddha. They had perceived in some of his sayings possibilities of development along lines more suited to the mentality of the masses. It was not difficult to transfigure an indescribable and inexplicable peace into a heaven blazing with gold and jewels, where birds of miracle sang the praises of the law, in trees flowering in unearthly beauty, and where redeemed souls, their sins forgiven, might sit immortal in the purity of unfolded lotus blossoms, to laud the divine Buddhas who had rescued them from all evil. We know that process in the West also. It was a philosophy still, in the sense that the Nicene and Athanasian creeds are philosophies, but one which fused hopes human and divine. In place of a remote and questionable heaven and wilderness of dubious spirits, China was to be given, for those who could take it, a philosophy of the soul more reasoned than any her own philosophers had offered, and, for those who could not, a God loving and compassionate, who having lived on earth could hear, help, and forgive sin, and at the end of the disappointments of life receive those who believed in him into the boat of souls, which would transfer them to the western paradise, there to dwell in immortal peace. And China was to give both of these new aspects to Korea and Japan, where each would be accepted according to the capacity of the recipients. It would have been easy to prophesy which would eventually possess and leaven China, the more so as the teaching of paradise and propitiation blended well with Confucianism, filling the dry cracks and crevices with living water, in which the lotus of purity could blossom. The greater Buddhist saints would act as mediators and guides, and the teachings of Lao-Tsu and Chuang-Tzu could also be revised and pressed into the service of the new hope, with a meaning they had lacked for many. Was it wonderful that such Chinese pilgrims as Fa Hien and Haiyuan Sang, preceded and followed by many other seekers less famous, should have set out along the frightful wastes of the Gobi Desert and over the terrible Himalayan snow peaks to find their way to India, the land of the Holy Grail, and to return laden with glorious manuscripts, statues of strange and shining beauty, and other spiritual riches, to confirm China in the Buddhist faith, which had opened a new heaven and a new earth? For those who desire romance there are few such noble romances as the journeys of Fa Hien, I Tsing, Haiyuan Sang, and their like. All who care for the fairylands of religion will read them with delight. So when Buddhism came to China in power, it was in the form of the popular Buddhism, and on that head I need say little. Both in China and Japan, as in the wide world, worship will be given to a God easily accessible, swift to hear prayer, to reward virtue, and to pardon sin. It brought exultation with it, a secular triumph of faith. And because of this it brought also a great wave of art in China. Buddhism, which taught with more than Wordsworthian force an indwelling divine presence in plant and tree, bird and animal, as in man, unlocked the doors dividing life into separate compartments. Making all one, it brought a passion of understanding, and desire to represent that understanding in the highest forms of art. So, in the 6th century AD, partly under the influence of the cognate teachings of Taoism as well as in the new inrush of Buddhist thought, there were formulated in China the 6 great canons of art to which it has conformed ever since. These are in themselves a high form of the philosophy of art to which life itself must conform. Of these the first only is necessary here, rhythmic vitality or spiritual vitality, or, as a gifted Japanese has rendered it, the life movement of the spirit through the rhythm of things. Without this no great art is possible. Rhythm is the vital point, and it had been so recognized by Lao-Tsu and Chuang centuries before. It connotes acting in harmony with the swing of the universe, whether spiritually, intellectually, or in the least movement of the body, from the physical movements of the dance of happy youth to the dance of the planets about the sun and the systems about the infinite. In each and all, they beheld this rhythm and harmony in the highest art, so that religion itself, working upon human stuff, is the great artist. Sculpturing it into what Confucius recognized as the princely man and Lao-Tsu as the perfection he saw but could find no words to define. In the actions and being of all great men, whether rightly or wrongly directed according to our human notions, this rhythm can be perceived. They march to an unstruck music, terrible or beautiful as the case may be. With the preparation which had already been theirs, the Chinese realized when Buddhism came with its doctrine of the indwelling spirit that here was the whole secret of the philosophy of art. This Buddhism taught that, to the eye of flesh plants and trees appear to be gross matter. But to the eye of the Buddha they are composed of minute spiritual particles, and that, grass, trees, countries, the earth itself, all these shall wholly enter into enlightenment. Thus all was spirit, and the office of art was to make that spirit, that wonderful efflux of life and vibration visible to all. Art could never be an imitative thing. It must be like religion itself, the thought of man's heart, the work of his hand, the two were in the deepest sense one. The point was not so to represent fruit that a man would stretch out his hand to pluck it, but to suggest the silent indwelling life that gives first the seed, the bud, the blossom, and lastly the fruit. With all the unity of the process with the life of man. Therefore, in the Chinese philosophy of art there is something God-possessed, the whirling on an orbit not to be calculated, but touching the outer spaces of vision and immortality. There are those who hold the belief that at a certain period of their art these people stand unrivaled in portraiture and landscape. The descriptions already given of their philosophies may, if analyzed, yield the secret why with the fusion of Buddhism to complete them this result followed, but the fact remains that so it was. They had learned the secret that art consists in the approach from the subjective side of the artist to the subjective side of whatever is painted, from a blade of grass to the face of a man. And having mastered the essential rhythm of life they themselves became masters. But it was not by the road leading to singing paradises that the deepest secrets of unity and realization, whether in art or elsewhere, were to be approached in China and Japan. There was an austerer way for those selected minds who could scale the heights, the way of concentration, contemplation, and realization. Yoga of the sternest type, such as is called in India jnana, in China Chan, and in Japan Zen, was to make an indelible mark upon the Far East. It cannot be called exclusively Buddhist, for its foundations were laid earlier than the Vedanta. But to China it came in a Buddhist guise about the year 520 AD, by the means of a most singular man, who can have little understood what the influence of his teaching would be in China and Japan. His name in religion was Bodhidharma, or the law of enlightenment, and what he taught was the yoga of the earlier Upanishads in its most ascetic and unconciliatory form. One sees him, a man of huge stature and haughty gesture, with the temperament of the militant monk which is common to all the faiths. He was ushered into the presence of the Chinese emperor, a devout and generous Buddhist, who said with reverence, "Many monasteries have I built, many scriptures have I distributed. Many alms have I given, and I have upheld the faith. Have I acquired merit? None whatever," answered Bodhidharma. In what then does true merit consist? In the obliteration of matter by absolute knowledge and not by external acts. This is the great truth acquired in the flash of cosmic consciousness, but very useless to present to a soul slowly developing along the path of evolution, which must eventually lead it to absolute truth. The emperor ventured again. Which is the divine and primal aspect of reality? One may suspect him of trying to suggest that after all he was not quite a beginner in these high subjects, and Bodhidharma of determination to stamp out any nascent sparks of imperial vanity. Reality has no aspect that is divine, was his answer. What are you, who have come before my throne? I do not know. Nor as a matter of fact does anyone else by experience, excepting the enlightened few who have reached the goal of samadhi or ecstatic contemplation. But Bodhidharma was mistaken in thinking he had brought a new gospel to China. He had brought systematized extension of the teachings of Lao-Tsu and Chuang, and for that reason his mission was certain to have results beyond what he could guess and quite independently of his own efforts. His philosophy may be summed up as follows. There is no such person as the Buddha. A rude shock until it is realized that there is no true individuality or personality in the universe. There is only the one of whom each and all are manifests or phenomena, if even that statement does not go too far. The Absolute is immanent in every man's heart, and this treasure of the heart is the only Buddha that exists. With this statement all who have truly understood the Upanishads would agree. Prayer, scripture reading, fasting, the observance of monastic rules, all are useless. This statement is more open to question, and appears more like the petulance of a man who having found one way denies the existence of all others. There are different levels of road for souls in every stage of evolution, and none is to be despised. Those who seek the Buddha do not find him. This may be qualified into the statement that those who seek the truth will find the Buddha and finding, comprehend, not the Buddha, but the cause which underlay the phenomenon of his life and teaching. One thing alone is necessary. To discover the unreality of the world by contemplation of the Absolute, which is at the root of each man's nature. This is of course absolutely true. Being asked to explain the word Zen, he replied, "This word Zen cannot be understood even of the wise. Zen means that a man should behold his fundamental nature. I have come from India only to teach that Buddhism is thought. As to so-called miracles, all such practices are heretical. They belong to the world of being. In other words, to the world of appearances." Such was the philosophy of Bodhidharma. It was driven home with austerities of thought, speech, and practice, calculated to repel the many, yet it invited chosen minds by giving the detailed instructions of India for attainment in yoga and the practice of contemplation by concentration. Lacking Buddhistic tradition, though it was rich in that of Vedanta, it fell back upon a legendary and beautiful scripture in which the Buddha passes on in utter silence the mystic meaning of the nirvana to his great disciple Mahakassapa, who receives it in its fullness with a smile and no word. So it should still need no words. It should be vision only. Zen became a power in China, and had its own patriarchate, dividing into the northern and southern schools. Its very austerities recommended it as a refreshing exercise to the rich and great. There is a very beautiful mystic poem relating to it, known as The Taming of the Bull, which should be given here were there space. It has been illustrated often both in Japan and China, and represents in wonderful symbols the attainment of realization or the highest consciousness by the soul of man, at first undisciplined, afterwards trained into perfect subjugation and finally into union. The influence of Zen on art in both China and Japan has been amazing for two reasons. First, the influence of contemplation upon the little understood psychology of the artist, and second, Its reaction in the form of a better understanding of how to manipulate, if such an expression may be used, the strange weapon of creative power. It is not too much to say that if artists, speaking of course generally of art, studied the science of contemplation as taught in Zen, unknown sources of power would be opened and the world be the richer. That it often has been done unconsciously and temperamentally there can be no doubt, but seldom with knowledge. China at all events received it as the language of art. They realized that as a shadow is to the object which casts it, so is the object itself to its eternal idea as perceived by a man possessing the higher consciousness. To this Zen taught the way, and the more so, because in teaching the doctrine of the universal it corresponded with the teaching of unity with the eternal, not only in man but in stone and plant and bird and beast. Cleave the stone and there am I, says Christ in one of the lately recovered logia. And China echoed the phrase as a new law. Yet in China its influence has almost died. Would art revive there if the spirit of Zen lived once more? Some allude to Zen, with a certain want of comprehension, as a system of self-hypnosis. That is an assumption that no mystic would for a moment admit. Some find an analogy in Quakerism. That there is a superficial likeness in the serenity and repose of Zen cannot be denied, but on that ground Zen may be likened to any belief which recognizes the indwelling divine. It is in truth that and much more, and when the suggestion is made that it may assuage the growing desire of Europe for the spiritual wine which alone quenches the thirst of the nations, I am inclined to agree. Though Zen will always be for the highly evolved souls, and the more simple forms of Vedantic and Buddhistic philosophy for the many. Neither has anything to fear from science, for neither is inseparable from historic dogma, and each is based on personal experience. Meditate and do, and you shall know. Knowledge and deed are then one. Zen was transplanted to Japan with extraordinary effect. There too it became a mighty influence for art and still more, or perhaps concordantly, for the molding of character. It cannot be doubted that it strengthened the natural bent of the Japanese toward the sympathetic and passionate contemplation of the beauty of nature, for to Zen the vibration of nature is in accord with the inmost rhythm and vibration of man. Lao-Tsu and Chuang had known this, but had not systematized the knowledge or experience as did the yoga discipline of Zen. They knew that belief in the false individuality of man must be expelled by contact with the influences of nature, and that on entering this experience he would recover the lost unity which makes him a participator in all the forces of the universe. This is a secret which the Western world has forgotten in its urbanization. It must relearn it at great cost, or lose it at greater. Our poets and the greatest of our artists have known this for themselves if not for others. Hear Keats, almost in the words of Chuang Tzu. The only way to strengthen one's intellect is to make up one's mind about nothing. Be passive and receptive. The poetic nature has no self. It is everything and nothing. A poet has no identity, he is continually in and filling some other body. I myself should say that the nature of those who know is impersonal as a sunbeam. It flits here and there, resting alike on the fetid swamp and the purity of the flashing waterfall. It dreams in the green gloom of the forest, is radiant on the sparkling snow peaks, the inhabitant, the spirit of the universe, everywhere glad and at home. In Japan Zen became a great philosophy for men of high intellect and percipience, blending naturally with the knightly austerity of the Japanese character. There are many sects or, as I prefer to call them, angles of Buddhist thought in Japan. The ethical Tendai, the mystic Shingen, Jodo, and the other paradisiacal angles so attractive to the masses, but Zen is, and probably will remain, an influence upon the educated and intellectual classes. It has a noble hardness, which appeals to the luminous mind. The sentimentality that tends to sweeten the developments of Buddhism otherwise and to crown them with compassionate saints as intercessors is absent there. For what is called the Buddha consciousness of Zen is the same as the perception of the formless world taught by early Buddhist saints. It corresponds with the higher states of consciousness now felt after by modern science. The teachers of Zen in Europe will probably be enlightened Japanese and those few men and women of the West who, very far removed from the charlatans and frauds that come from the mysterious Orient, have themselves experienced something of its effects. On the intellect and the spirit. It is not necessary to speak much individually of the philosophy of Japan. What is ancient in her thought besides her own Shinto is derived from India, the great original mother of Asiatic philosophy. Of her acceptation of Western philosophies little need here be said. On Shinto some words are necessary. There is a singularity in Shinto, the state religion of Japan, which renders it alien to the Western mind. Despite certain aspects of beauty and a Spartan element, which did much to foster the knightly code of the samurai, it is difficult for a European to connect it with any ideas of a philosophy to be ranked beside the Vedantist or Buddhist, the Confucian, Taoist, or any Western system. And yet it is impossible to leave it wholly out of account. It is based on myth and nature worship, and it has resulted in a belief in myriads of spirits, male and female, who inhabit not only natural objects but many others. The name Shinto is Chinese and signifies the way of the spirits. Its Japanese equivalent is kami no michi, and these kami are the indwelling spirits. So far one might take it as a parable of natural forces, as indeed it probably partly is. But its origin is lost in obscurity for the reason that until the 5th century of our era the Japanese had no writing, and all was handed down by tradition and memory. At that time Japan received the Chinese learning through Korea, and a book dating from 712 AD is the earliest written informant on these beliefs. It is said to have been taken down from the lips of an old man, a famous reciter of the myths and traditions. This, the Kojiki, is a storehouse of them. The Nihongi, which purports to be a fuller account, dates from 720 AD. And the greatest authority on the deeply interesting ritual of Shinto is the Yenjishiki, which gives minute directions for it, a ritual still faithfully carried out, though it cannot be denied that Buddhist influence has crept into Shinto thought. This was unavoidable, and many Japanese do not regret it. More than one highly educated Japanese has told me that he is Confucian, Buddhist, and Shintoist, and that the ideals do not clash. The fact that the emperor's family traces back to the sun goddess, formerly known as Amaterasu Omikami, the great god who illumines heaven. Known chiefly now by the Chinese form of Tensho-Daijin, and that many of the nobler families are said to spring from the lesser gods, is sufficient to account for the retention of Shinto as a state religion. Even if its antiquity and its purely Japanese origin did not ensure its position for patriotic reasons. The Shinto temples have also a peculiar beauty, which exercises influence both on art and character. An exquisiteness of extreme simplicity and delicacy of purity and cleanliness cannot but have a reflex action upon the souls of those who worship. The gods have mystic souls or jewels, dwelling invisibly in the temples, and through them earth may have audience of heaven. These are known as mitama, and in each great shrine the mitama is represented by a material object known as the shintai or spirit body. Sometimes it is a mirror or a sword, such as are used at the coronation, more exactly, the investiture, of the emperor at Kyoto. Sometimes it may be a round stone. But be the shintai what it may, it is only an earthly symbol of the mysterious mitama, and the two must not be confounded. The chief points of the Shinto faith are patriotism and loyalty. There is little individual prayer, and the emperor and his delegates are spokesmen, as in China, for national needs. There is much propitiation, much deprecation of the anger of the easily offended deities. The dance is a part of the ritual, especially the pantomimic dance with masks and music. There is much pilgrimage to famous shrines. As an ethic or philosophy, what shall be said of it? There is an ethic, but it is based not so much on the spiritual results to the offender as on the offense, physical or spiritual, of impurity in the sight of the gods. With death the Shinto gods have no concern. It is impure and therefore outside their province. As in the Greek play of Hippolytus, the divine Artemis cannot approach her devoted worshipper in his unjustly caused death agonies, but hangs a span's length from the ground pollute, so with the Shinto kami. Shinto funerals in Japan date only from 1868. They did not concern the kami. Here is a specimen of an old Shinto prayer, slightly shortened. If the high gods will bestow the latter harvest in rice ears many a hand's breadth long and abundant, produced by the labor of men from whose arms the sweat drops down and on whose opposing thighs the mud has gathered, I will fulfill their praises by humbly offering 1,000 firstfruits of ears, setting up the jars of sake and setting in rows the bellies of the sake jars. And I will present them plain sweet herbs and bitter herbs of plants growing in the great moors, and of dwellers in the blue sea plain I will give edible seaweed from the offing and seaweed from the shore. Also blight stuffs and shining stuffs and coarse stuffs. And with these I will fulfill your praise. Japanese who should know claim that the influence of Shinto upon the national character has been wholly good and that the Kannushi, the Shinto priest, has played his part satisfactorily in national life. They are not, however, priests in any sense of the word recognized in the West. They are appointed by the civil authorities. They have no care of the people and, clad in nothing priestly or symbolic but in an ancient court habit, they have only ritual as their duties. In Japan, as in China, deep and reverent honor is paid to the spirits of dead ancestors and relatives. In Japan this has been found a great and noble binding influence in family life and therefore in the national life spiritual and material. But on the whole the cold austerity of Shinto produced an atmosphere in Japan that required the Buddhist fire to warm it, the Confucian ethic to animate it and make it emotional. To Buddhism it owes its magnificent no plays and the higher forms of art, and uncountable debts besides. Japan would not be Japan without it. She accepted all with avid hands. What the future of Shinto may be who dares to prophesy? There have been many Japanese philosophers, men whose writings breathe serenity, tranquil wisdom, and a joy in nature and beauty intellectual and spiritual. These will repay Western readers fully for any search they make. Such writers as Kaibara Eken in his Way of Contentment and many others. But this book concerns itself with sources, and Japanese philosophy is so largely derivative that it requires treatment from quite another point of view than mine. It should, I think, be accepted more as literature and literature of a very high order. It is deeply indebted to Shinto also, but Shinto so interwoven with Buddhism and Confucianism that the effect upon the mind is that of a cord of 3 strands. Each strand a different color yet blending into a whole that forms a new and beautiful revelation of color in itself. It would never be surprising if the acute Japanese mind brooding on the philosophies of East and West should evolve new and startling applications and combinations of all 3, for the understanding of the world of causes and that of appearances. Among nations Japan is the great transmuter, and it may be well indeed for the West that their circle has been opened for an Oriental sister bringing aptitudes new to us to bear upon the problems of life and death. I conclude this survey of Asiatic thought and thinkers with the words of a distinguished Asiatic, Ananda Kumaraswamy, for they sum up all philosophic aspiration. The chosen people of the future can be no nation, no race, but an aristocracy of the whole world in whom the vigor of European action will be united to the serenity of Asiatic thought. That is the only hope I know of for the future of East and West. Chapter 30. Prophecy. The main streams of thought flowed from the heights as the rivers Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Jumna rise in the great northern mountains and, flowing through, irrigate and fertilize the harvests of widely differing countries. Will it be so with the thoughts I have outlined in this book or will they remain only the sustenance of Asia? That, I think, cannot be. Europe, in which I include America, has gone her own way, protesting that the religion she derived from the Nearer East was good enough for her, and that she needed no light from outer Asia. She little knew what was hidden by the ramparts of the Himalayas and the boundaries of the great passes. But she can scarcely have been said to have found her own soul in the teachings of the Semitic peoples. Will she return to what was in its undeveloped stage the teaching of men of the same blood and spirit as her own? I cannot think that Europe will ever profess one of the great Asiatic faiths in the sense of calling itself Vedantic or Buddhist. Perhaps even in Asia such labels will tend to disappear, because as time goes on the mind of man will become more and more eclectic, assimilating the best from all. But since the great faiths are bridges, not barriers, I believe they will encourage the passage of the thought of mankind across all the frontiers of faith. In all such matters India must lead the world, for she made spiritual exploration her chief preoccupation and, knowing where others guessed, charted the ways. Now that the narrow theology of the Jews is passing away, and a new aspect of Christianity developing in the West, I believe it will tend more and more to identify itself with the great Vedantic teachings. And the utilitarian philosophies of Europe will plume themselves with the wings of the Himalayan eagles. Spinoza, Blake, Nietzsche, and many more envisaged the possibility of a race of supermen who should guide the earth when the will-o'-the-wisps of democracy have led the destinies of mankind into quagmires from which they will be long in escaping. India has shown the very different road by which these supermen may assume their birthright, and I believe the West will realize steadily if slowly that for philosophy, science, and social evolution, all that concerns the daily life of man, there is only one unshakable basis, and that divine, as the East has taught, but scarcely practiced in its fullness. This is prophecy, and those entrenched in their own beliefs will laugh at the possibility. Even they, however, may see in the outlines I have traced something grand, shadowy, and immutable, like the peaks of mountains seen in mist where the gods dwell above the thunder. I write in Ceylon with all the thought of Asia surging round me, and meeting the science and commerce of the West like contending breakers. If either conquers it will be a calamity for the world, for it is the hope of the future that East and West may meet and mingle in the brotherhood of the Spirit, beside which outer forms are as nothing. Each has much to conquer before that day dawns. That its rising sun may not long be below the horizon is the aspiration of all who know and love both. The end.